He constructed an elaborate digital lie so convincing that one man destroyed her entire life. 4 years of homelessness, poverty, and false accusation. Now, DNA proves the son is his, not his brother's, and one family's dark secret unravels in court. Before we dive in, comment below telling us where you're watching from around the world, and don't forget to click subscribe. The penthouse overlooked the entire city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Manhattan's glittering skyline like a painting commissioned by wealth itself. Victoria Chen stood barefoot on the cold marble, watching dawn break over the Hudson River, her silk robe tied loosely around her waist. Behind her, the man who owned this view, this building, this entire corner of the world was still sleeping. His name was Daniel Bradford, and he was about to destroy her life. Victoria didn't know that yet. She was thinking about the dinner they'd planned for tonight, the little French bistro in Soho where he'd first kissed her 3 months ago. She was thinking about how his hand felt on her skin, how his laugh made something inside her crack open in a way she'd carefully sealed shut years ago. She was thinking about love, in a way that felt dangerous and thrilling, and absolutely inevitable. She didn't hear him wake up. She didn't know he was standing in the bedroom doorway, watching her, his expression transforming from soft desire into something harder, colder, like watching ice form over still water. She only turned when she heard his voice, rough and strange, saying her name like a curse. "Victoria, we need to talk. We need." She turned, smiling, expecting morning light and kisses. Instead, she found a stranger wearing Daniel Bradford's face. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. His eyes, those warm brown eyes that had looked at her with such tenderness just hours ago, were now filled with something that looked like rage and betrayal and disgust all wound together. "What's wrong?" Victoria moved toward him instinctively, her hand reaching out. Did something happen? He stepped back, away from her touch like it burned. Like she burned. "My brother called me an hour ago," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "He's in town. He wants to take me to brunch to celebrate my engagement. Except Victoria, I never told him I was engaged. I never told anyone. The only person I told was you." Victoria felt confusion ripple through her, a small disturbance in the still water of her happiness. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel wasn't finished. "You know what he said to me? He said congratulations on finally settling down with such a beautiful woman. And then he described you. He described you perfectly, Victoria. Every detail. And he laughed. He actually laughed and said he'd always wondered what you'd look like when you weren't, and I quote, wearing quite so many clothes." The words hung in the air like poison gas, invisible but deadly, seeping into every corner of the penthouse, into every happy memory of the past 3 months, transforming them into something ugly and false. "No," Victoria whispered. "Daniel, no, that's not. I would never, that's..." But he was already moving, already pulling clothes from his walk-in closet, already putting distance between them that felt like it might never close. His movements were sharp, angry, economical. He didn't look at her. He couldn't seem to stand looking at her. "How long?" His voice cracked on the question. "How long have you been sleeping with my brother? Is this some kind of game to you? Get close to me, get access to my money, my connections, and then also..." "Stop," Victoria said, and there was a strength in her voice that came from somewhere deep, somewhere that knew how to survive because it had been surviving her whole life. "Daniel, stop. Look at me. I have never met your brother. I didn't even know you had a brother until you mentioned him 2 weeks ago." He whipped around then, his face twisted. "You're lying. You're standing here in my apartment in my bed, and you're lying to my face. My brother doesn't make things up, Victoria. He doesn't joke about this kind of thing." Her heart was pounding now, a wild trapped bird against her ribs. This was happening. This was actually happening. The careful life she'd built, the careful steps she'd taken to move away from her past, to become someone new, someone worthy, someone who deserved good things and kind hands and love. was crumbling with the casual words of a man she'd never met. "Call him," Victoria said urgently. "Call him right now. Put me on the phone with him. He's lying, Daniel. For whatever reason, he's lying. And we can figure this out right now if you just—" But Daniel was already picking up his phone, already dialing with shaking fingers, and Victoria watched his face change as the call connected. She watched him listen to whatever his brother was saying on the other end of the line, and she saw the moment he decided to believe the lie. It was like watching someone choose to believe the worst possible version of the truth, choosing betrayal over faith, choosing to destroy something beautiful rather than consider that his own family might be cruel or dishonest or motivated by something darker than she could understand. When he hung up, his eyes were dead. That was the worst part. Not the anger, which had at least been evidence of passion, of caring, but this deadness, like he'd simply ceased to see her as a person, like she'd become a problem to be solved. "I want you out," he said quietly. "Out of my apartment, out of my life. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear from you. And if you try to contact me or my family again, I'll have my lawyers contact you about a restraining order. My lawyers are very good, Victoria, and they're very expensive, and they will make your life very difficult." She left because she had no choice. She packed an overnight bag with shaking hands while Daniel stood in the bedroom doorway, watching her like a guard ensuring a prisoner didn't steal anything on her way out. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But inside, something was breaking. Something was coming apart at the cellular level. Something that understood that the worst had happened. The thing she'd always feared. The thing she'd worked so hard to prevent. The accusations came next. Slowly at first, then all at once. Like dominoes falling. Daniel told his friends. His friends told other people. The story evolved and mutated the way stories do, taking on new colors and textures and details that had never existed. She'd seduced him on purpose. She was a gold digger. She'd been sleeping with both brothers to extract money from the family. She was unstable, dishonest, manipulative. She'd been lying about her entire background, her entire identity, her entire self. Victoria lost her job the day the rumors reached her workplace. Her boss, a woman named Patricia who'd hired her personally and mentored her for 2 years, called her into her office with an expression of deep, almost pitying regret. "I'm so sorry," Patricia said, not meeting her eyes. "But we've been contacted by the Bradford legal team. They've made it clear that if we continue to employ you, there could be serious consequences for the company. We need to let you go. Effective immediately. Please clean out your desk." Victoria didn't fight it. She understood how this worked. She'd grown up watching people with money and power use those things like weapons, had learned early that justice wasn't blind. It was just selectively sighted. The Bradford family had decided her guilt, and that was the only verdict that mattered. The apartment came next. She couldn't afford it without her job, and when she tried to find a new place, landlords suddenly became very careful, very hesitant, very interested in why she'd left her previous employment. Background checks came back flagged. References didn't answer calls. Credit checks shifted from acceptable to questionable. She ended up in a studio in Queens that was barely larger than a closet, with a bathroom so small she could almost touch both walls if she stretched her arms out, and a refrigerator that ran constantly with a sound like a dying animal. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors arguing, having sex, crying, living lives that bled through the space between them. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she could rebuild. She told herself the truth would eventually matter, would eventually shine through the darkness of the lie, would eventually make everything right again. She was young enough and optimistic enough to believe these things, or at least young enough to pretend to believe them. What she didn't know was that time wasn't her friend in this situation. Time wasn't going to be kind. Time was going to stretch the story wider and deeper, was going to give people years to believe the lie, was going to make the lie so comfortable, so familiar, that the truth, when it finally came, would feel like a disruption to something that had calcified into permanence. The first year was about survival. Victoria took every job she could find. She worked as a barista at a coffee shop in Astoria, earning just enough to cover rent and ramen. She worked as a temp at a staffing agency, filling in for people who were on vacation or sick leave, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments or be seen as a real employee. She worked nights cleaning offices, pushing a vacuum through empty corporate spaces that smelled like floor wax in desperation. Her body learned a new kind of exhaustion. Not the mental exhaustion of a bad day at work, but the bone-deep cellular exhaustion of someone running on fumes, someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks, someone whose nervous system had locked into a state of permanent crisis. She didn't date. She didn't go out. She didn't trust anyone with even the smallest piece of her story, because she'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury item, something that only belonged to people who had nothing to lose. She wore a sort of invisibility cloak, made of tired clothes and careful neutrality. She became very good at being unmemorable. One morning, almost exactly a year after she'd walked out of Daniel Bradford's penthouse, Victoria was cleaning the offices of a pharmaceutical company in Midtown. It was 4 a.m, the city still draped in darkness, and she was pushing her vacuum down a hallway lined with framed photographs when one of them caught her eye. It was a corporate photo, the kind where everyone stands in front of a blue background and pretends to smile naturally. There was Daniel Bradford, still beautiful, still the man she'd loved, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in a month. But he wasn't alone. There was another man beside him, so similar that they could only be brothers. The resemblance was unmistakable. And even though this man's face was frozen in a corporate smile, Victoria could see something in his eyes. Something dark and amused and cruel. Something that suggested he enjoyed the power he'd wielded by speaking a single lie that had blown apart someone else's life like it was nothing. Daniel's hand was on his brother's shoulder in a gesture of affection or approval or both. They looked like a team, like a unit, like men who understood each other perfectly and had probably spent their entire lives conspiring and strategizing and deciding who to harm next. Victoria took a photo of the photograph with her phone. She didn't know why. She didn't have a plan. But some instinct that had kept her alive told her to document this, to hold on to this evidence that these men existed, that they were real, that they'd chosen to destroy her without hesitation or remorse. It took her 3 years to get enough saved up for a lawyer, 3 years of cleaning offices and serving coffee and living in a space barely larger than a closet. 3 years of turning down every romantic overture, every invitation to go out, every opportunity to live like a normal person of her age, because she was too afraid of being hurt again, too afraid of trusting, too afraid of letting anyone close enough to disappoint her. The lawyer's name was Marcus Webb, and he operated out of a small office in a brownstone in Brooklyn. He had salt and pepper hair and the kind of intelligent, measured expression that suggested he'd seen a lot of human nature, and none of it particularly surprised him. He listened while Victoria told her story. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to comfort her or suggest that things would be fine. He simply listened, taking notes occasionally, his expression remaining neutral until she finished. When she was done, he set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment. "This is going to be difficult," he said finally. "The Bradford family has significant resources and significant power. They've had 4 years to solidify their story, to make sure everyone they know believes it, to ensure that the accusation sticks. You're asking me to help you undo that. You're asking me to fight against momentum that's been building for years." "I know," Victoria said quietly. "But," Marcus continued, "there's something in your favor. The story doesn't make sense. Not really. If you were the kind of person they've described, if you were really a gold digger and a manipulator in everything they've accused you of, there would be evidence. There would be a pattern. There would be other victims. And from what I can find, there aren't any. You disappeared. You went silent. You didn't try to capitalize on the situation at all." "That's because I didn't do anything wrong," Victoria said. "I know." Marcus smiled slightly. "Which means we have something to work with. We have innocence, which is a lot less common than you'd think. And we have time. Time is a weapon nobody expects. Let me start making some calls. Let me see what we can find out about Daniel Bradford's brother. Let me see what kind of man he really is." What Marcus found in those first weeks was interesting. Daniel's brother, whose name was Christopher Bradford, had a history. Not a criminal history exactly, but a pattern of behavior that suggested he was someone who liked to cause problems, someone who enjoyed stirring up chaos and then watching how people responded. There were ex-girlfriends who'd experienced sudden, devastating social rejection after dating him. There were friends who'd been accused of theft, or infidelity, or worse, always based on his word alone, always resulting in the accused being cast out of their social circle. The more Marcus dug, the clearer the picture became. Christopher Bradford was a predator of a particular type. He didn't hurt people with violence or direct confrontation. He hurt them with lies, with social engineering, with his ability to make people believe his version of reality rather than anyone else's. And he did it because it amused him, because it made him feel powerful, because he seemed to have no capacity for empathy or guilt. The question was why he'd targeted Victoria. Marcus sent her to sit for a long interview, asking her about her time with Daniel, about what she looked like, about where she came from, about anything that might have caught Christopher's attention. It came down to race. Marcus said it quietly in his office, with his hands folded on his desk. Christopher saw you with his brother. He saw that his brother, who'd always been a certain way, who'd always played by certain rules, was genuinely happy with you. And for someone like Christopher, genuine happiness in someone else is intolerable. So he destroyed it. He did it as a test, probably. Or maybe he did it because he could. Maybe he looked at you, a black woman dating his wealthy white brother, and he decided that was something that needed to be corrected. Maybe he looked at your happiness and decided it was an affront to his view of how the world should work. Victoria listened to this analysis and felt something shift inside her. For 4 years, she'd blamed herself. She'd internalized the accusations, had started to believe that there was something wrong with her, something that invited this kind of treatment, something that made her worthy of such casual destruction. Now Marcus was telling her that the problem wasn't her. The problem was the men. The problem was a system that allowed men like Christopher to weaponize lies without facing consequences. The problem was a society that believed the worst about women who looked like her, that found the accusations credible precisely because of who she was. The truth felt like a knife, sharp and painful, but also clarifying. It didn't fix anything. It didn't give her back the years she'd lost, or the career she might have had, or the relationships she'd been too afraid to pursue. But it did something important. It shifted the shame from her shoulders to where it belonged. Now we need to prove it, Marcus said. And to do that, we need to know more about what happened. We need to understand the mechanism. We need to know how Christopher convinced Daniel so completely, how he made the lie so solid that your denials couldn't penetrate it. Victoria had been thinking about this for 4 years. She'd analyzed the morning of the accusation over and over again, had tried to understand what Daniel's brother could have said to make him believe so completely, had tried to pinpoint the exact moment when love transformed into hatred. He said he'd always wondered what I looked like, Victoria said slowly. When I wasn't wearing so many clothes, he knew details about me, things a stranger wouldn't know. And somehow he made it seem like we had a history, like there was a history, and Daniel just accepted it. So Christopher researched you, Marcus said. He found out information. He studied you. And then he used that information to make the story seem credible. But he couldn't have researched me without help, Victoria realized. I didn't have a social media presence. I wasn't in the society pages. How would he even know what I looked like unless someone described you to him, Marcus finished, or showed him pictures. Or, he paused, his expression changing slightly. Marcus pulled his laptop around and started typing. Tell me, he said without looking up. Did Daniel ever show you his family photos on his phone? Yes, Victoria said. Several times. He had pictures of them on vacation in the Hamptons, pictures from Thanksgiving, pictures from his parents' anniversary party. And did you ever touch his phone? Ever hold it yourself? I might have, Victoria said. He'd show me pictures and I'd hold it to get a better look. Why? Because, Marcus said, turning the laptop toward her. If Daniel left you alone with his phone at any point, Christopher could have accessed it. He could have seen the pictures. He could have created a digital trail that made it seem like you were in his phone for reasons that proved you and he had communicated. Victoria felt her stomach turn. She thought about those moments, casual and intimate, when Daniel had handed her his phone to scroll through photos. She thought about how exposed she'd been, how vulnerable, how completely ignorant of the trap being set. He engineered this, Marcus said with certainty. Very carefully, very deliberately. And he did it because he could, and because it would hurt his brother, and because he probably wanted to hurt you specifically. The question now is whether we can prove it. And that, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, is where we're going to need to get creative. Victoria left Marcus's office that day feeling both more hopeful and more angry than she had in years. The anger was clarifying. It burned away the last remnants of self-blame and replaced them with something harder, something that knew how to fight. But the next step required something she wasn't sure she had. It required her to approach Daniel Bradford again. It required her to knock on a door she thought had closed forever. It required her to place herself in a position where he could hurt her again, where he could reject her again, where he could make her feel like she was the problem when she knew, absolutely knew, that she wasn't. Marcus had a plan, though. Marcus always had a plan, and it involved Victoria finding a way to get close to Daniel one more time. It involved her explaining what had actually happened. It involved her asking him to do something that would have been unthinkable 4 years ago when he'd looked at her with such contempt. It involved asking him to believe her. 4 years of silence stretched between them like an ocean. Victoria had rehearsed this moment so many times that the words felt worn smooth in her mind, polished by repetition, until they'd lost almost all meaning. But now, standing outside his office building in Midtown, watching the crowds of people move past her in their expensive suits and their expensive shoes, she understood that rehearsal could only take you so far. The actual moment was going to be different. The actual moment was going to be everything. She'd waited outside his building for 3 days before she saw him. He emerged from the lobby at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening, alone, still beautiful in that careless way that came from never having to worry about anything, never having to wake up in the morning and calculate how to survive. He was talking on his phone, gesturing with one hand, completely unaware of her presence. Daniel. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she watched his face go through a series of expressions. First confusion, like he didn't quite recognize her. Then recognition, and with it came something else. Anger, disgust. The hardening of his features into something hostile and unwelcoming. He didn't say hello. He just stopped walking and looked at her like she was something that had appeared on his shoe. How did you get past security? His voice was cold. I called your office. I told them I was an old friend. I told them I needed to speak with you about something important. Victoria kept her hands visible, kept her voice steady, kept every ounce of desperation and hope hidden away in a locked box inside her chest where he couldn't weaponize it. I have nothing to say to you, Daniel said, and he started walking again. I'm going to ask you one time to stop following me. If you do it again, I'll have security escort you out. I'm not here to hurt you. Victoria followed him, moving quickly to keep up. I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened. I'm here to tell you about your brother. My brother, Daniel repeated, and there was something in his voice that made her think she'd made a terrible mistake. My brother is an excellent man. My brother is nothing like you. He was helping his friend into a car waiting at the curb, moving with the precision of someone who'd planned this exit beforehand, someone who'd been preparing for the possibility that she might appear and ruin his evening. Daniel, please. Just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes and then I'll leave and you'll never see me again. He paused with one foot already in the car. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was deciding whether to trust that she meant what she said, whether 5 minutes was worth the risk of hearing something that might complicate his carefully constructed narrative of the past 4 years. Okay, he said finally. 5 minutes. But not here. Not on the street. I'm going to dinner. You're going to follow me to the restaurant, and you're going to sit at a separate table, and after I eat, I'll give you 5 minutes in my car, and then you're going to disappear from my life permanently. Do you understand? Yes, Victoria said, not pointing out that he'd just given her more than 5 minutes, just grateful that he'd given her any time at all. The restaurant was upscale in the way that things became more expensive, the less obvious they tried to be about it. Minimalist design, white tablecloths, wine bottles that cost more than her weekly rent. Daniel was seated at the best table, a booth against the window that looked out over the city like a stage set designed to showcase power and success. Victoria sat at a small table across the room, her hands shaking too much to hold the water glass they'd placed in front of her. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a salad she couldn't eat, and watched Daniel as he moved through his dinner with the ease of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, completely confident in his position in the world, completely unaware that everything he believed about her might be wrong. When he finished, he stood and walked past her without acknowledging her existence. She left cash on the table and followed him out into the night. The car was a Mercedes, sleek and dark and smelling of expensive leather. Daniel sat in the back seat and gestured for her to join him. He didn't turn to look at her when he spoke. Talk. I didn't sleep with your brother. Victoria started, the words tumbling out in a rush now that she actually had permission to speak. I've never met your brother. I didn't know you had a brother until you mentioned him during our relationship. And I could never do what he told you I did. He was here for brunch. Daniel's voice was flat. He came to the penthouse. He saw pictures of you in my apartment, which he could have seen because you showed them to him, Victoria said quietly, or because you left your phone somewhere he could access it. But the point is, Daniel, your brother is lying. He's lying because he wanted to hurt me, and he wanted to hurt you, and he succeeded because you believed him instead of believing me. I believed him because it made sense, Daniel said. He looked at her for the first time since getting in the car. You weren't who I thought you were. You were complicated. You had secrets. We all have secrets. Victoria chose her words very carefully. That doesn't mean I'm guilty of something. So why are you here now? Why are you telling me this now? Because I have a lawyer who's willing to help me prove it. Because I have evidence. Because I'm tired of my life being destroyed by a lie. And because, Victoria paused. This was the hard part. Because I think you deserve to know that you were wrong about me. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Outside the car, the city moved through its evening routines, people going places, living lives that seemed impossibly normal. I can't believe you, he said finally. I've spent 4 years believing something else. You can't just appear and expect me to suddenly reverse that. I'm not asking you to believe me on faith. I'm asking you to get a DNA test. Daniel looked at her with an expression of confusion that quickly transformed into understanding and then into something that looked like horror. Ah, he said. Ah, that's what this is about. There's something you need to know, Victoria said. Something your brother probably didn't mention. Something that will prove that I'm telling the truth. She told him about the child. She told him about the daughter who'd been born 9 months after they'd stopped seeing each other. About the daughter who had dark skin like her mother, and green eyes that could only have come from his side of the family. She told him about raising this child alone, about working 3 jobs to pay for daycare, about the constant fear that somehow Daniel would find out and take the child from her just like he'd taken everything else. She told him about the blood test results she'd had done 6 months ago, just to be absolutely certain, just so she'd have proof if she ever got the chance to prove it. She told him that the child was biologically his son, not his brother's, not anyone else's, but his, conceived during their time together, carried through the pregnancy in secret, raised in poverty and near homelessness because his brother's lies had made it impossible for her to survive. Daniel's face had gone completely white. He looked like a man who'd been punched, like a man whose entire reality had been destabilized, like a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Not just to her, but to his own child. To a person who shared his DNA and would never know him because of choices he'd made based on lies. Where is he? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Where is our son? At home with a babysitter right now. 4 years old. He has your eyes, actually, or at least your bone structure. He'll probably grow up to look exactly like you. He'll grow up not knowing his father, not knowing his family, not knowing that half of who he is comes from people with resources and power and connections. He'll grow up as the child of a single mother who couldn't get a job, couldn't get an apartment, couldn't do much of anything because everyone believed a lie about her. "I need to see him," Daniel said. "No," Victoria said firmly. "Not until we've handled this properly. Not until your brother is held accountable for what he did. Not until you've actually acknowledged that you were wrong about me. You don't get to just walk back into his life. You don't get to just suddenly be a father. You have to take responsibility for your own actions first. You have to admit what you did to me." Daniel was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, broken, devastated. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, Victoria. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I let my brother poison my mind. I'm sorry I accused you of something you didn't do. I'm sorry for taking away 4 years of your life. I'm sorry for every bad thing that happened to you, because of my stupidity and my weakness and my willingness to believe the worst about you, without even considering that he might be lying." The apology was real. She could hear it in his voice, feel it in the way his whole body seemed to be collapsing in on itself as he confronted the weight of his own culpability. But apologies didn't fix anything. Apologies didn't return the years. Apologies didn't untraumatize a person or undo the damage done to their sense of self and safety and possibility. "I need your help now," Victoria said. "I need you to give a statement to my lawyer. I need you to tell him exactly what your brother said to you, exactly how he convinced you, exactly what he did to engineer this situation. I need you to be willing to testify if we have to go to court." "I'll do it," Daniel said immediately. "I'll do whatever you need. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with so much regret and pain that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I just need to know my son's name." "Marcus," Victoria said. "His name is Marcus, and with that name, with that acknowledgement that she was willing to give him even a small piece of what she'd kept hidden for 4 years, something fundamental shifted. The story that had consumed both of their lives for the past 4 years was beginning to change. The lie that had seemed so immovable, so permanent, so much like the truth, was starting to crack. But the cracks didn't mean it was over. They meant it was beginning. They meant that the real fight was about to start. They meant that Victoria was finally going to get the chance to prove her innocence, to prove that she'd been telling the truth all along, to prove that sometimes the most devastating lies can finally be exposed if someone is willing to fight long enough and hard enough to make people look at the evidence instead of the narrative. As she stepped out of the car that night and walked back toward the subway, toward the small apartment in Queens where her 4-year-old son was waiting for her, toward the life she'd been building without help from anyone, Victoria allowed herself to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in 4 years. She allowed herself to feel hope. The morning after her confrontation with Daniel, Victoria woke to find her phone filled with messages. Text messages, emails, a voicemail from Marcus Webb saying he needed to speak with her immediately. She called him back before she'd even had coffee, her heart racing with a mixture of dread and cautious optimism. Marcus's voice, when he answered, held a quality of barely contained excitement that she'd never heard before in their months of working together. "Victoria, Daniel Bradford came to see me yesterday evening. He gave a statement. A full, detailed statement about everything his brother told him, everything Christopher said to convince him, everything about how the scenario was constructed. And Victoria, this is the key piece we've been waiting for." Her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit down on the edge of her bed. "What? What did he tell you?" "He told me that Christopher didn't just make up the story. He showed him evidence, or what looked like evidence. Photos that appeared to have been taken in your apartment, messages that seemed to be from you, things that made the accusation seem credible. Daniel kept records of all of it. He took screenshots. He saved everything." Victoria's mind was spinning. Evidence. The kind of evidence that could prove not just that she was innocent, but that Christopher had deliberately, methodically fabricated a false narrative. Where did these photos come from? How did he even? She trailed off, trying to piece it together. "That's what we need to figure out," Marcus said. "But I have a theory. I think Christopher hacked Daniel's phone. I think he planted false messages. I think he doctored photos or took them from social media and edited them. I think he did everything he could to make a lie look like the truth. And I think now that we have Daniel's cooperation and his evidence, we might finally have enough to prove it. Marcus's next move was brilliant in its simplicity. He hired a digital forensics expert, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lynn, who specialized in detecting altered images and fabricated digital evidence. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Lynn had compiled a comprehensive report detailing exactly how Christopher had constructed the false evidence. The photos had been doctored using fairly sophisticated editing software, but not perfectly. Dr. Lynn found traces of the original images, pixels that didn't quite match, colors that had been altered just enough to suggest manipulation. The messages appeared to have been screenshot fabrications, images created to look like texts without actually accessing the phone. The timeline didn't match. The metadata didn't align. The entire digital edifice of Christopher's lie began to crumble under scientific scrutiny. But more importantly, Dr. Lynn found evidence of hacking. Someone with technical knowledge had accessed Daniel's phone remotely, installing software that allowed them to monitor his communications, track his location, and potentially intercept or manipulate his messages. The timeline of the installation matched perfectly with the dates when Christopher claimed to have received the incriminating information about Victoria. Christopher Bradford hadn't just lied. He'd committed multiple federal crimes in service of that lie. He'd committed fraud. He'd committed hacking. He'd committed identity theft. He'd constructed an elaborate false narrative using illegal means. Marcus brought this information to the Bradford family lawyers, expecting them to lawyer up, to deny, to fight. Instead, he got a call from Daniel Bradford's father, a man named Richard Bradford, who sounded like his entire worldview had just been shattered into a million pieces. "I need to see you," Richard said. "In person. I need to understand what my son did, and why." The meeting took place in the offices of the Bradford family's primary legal team, in a high-rise on Park Avenue that made Victoria's previous office building look quaint. Richard Bradford was a tall man in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested a lifetime of getting what he wanted. Beside him sat a woman Victoria assumed was his wife, and beside them sat Daniel, looking devastated and defeated in a way that suggested he'd already confessed everything. Richard listened while Marcus presented the evidence. He listened while Dr. Lynn explained the digital forensics. He listened while Daniel confirmed that his brother had indeed orchestrated the entire thing, that Christopher had confessed to hacking his phone and fabricating evidence, that Christopher had done it as a form of entertainment, a way to assert control and power over his brother's life. When everything had been laid out, Richard Bradford put his face in his hands for a long moment. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I don't know how this happened," he said quietly. "I don't know what's wrong with Christopher that he would do something like this. But I know that we have to make it right. I know that we have to take responsibility for what my son did." He turned to Marcus. "What does Victoria Chen want? What would make this right?" "There's no making it right," Marcus said carefully. "You can't return 4 years of her life. You can't erase the damage that's been done to her career, her reputation, her emotional well-being. But you can take responsibility. You can support legal action against Christopher. You can issue a public statement acknowledging that she was falsely accused. And you can provide financial restitution for the damages she suffered." Richard Bradford nodded, and Victoria could see the moment when he truly accepted responsibility, the moment when the full weight of what his family had done, what his son had done, settled onto his shoulders like a physical thing. "Whatever it takes," he said. "I want Victoria Chen to know that my family takes full responsibility for this." The case that followed was spectacular in its way. Christopher Bradford was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, hacking, and filing a false report. His lawyers tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, a joke taken too far, a moment of weakness. But the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. What sealed his conviction was a digital recording discovered on his personal computer, a voice memo where he documented his entire plan. He'd recorded himself explaining how he was going to destroy Victoria to prove that he had power over his brother, to prove that he could construct an alternate reality and make people believe it. He'd talked about how satisfying it was to watch his brother turn against his girlfriend, how entertaining he found the chaos. He'd bragged about how he could do this to anyone, how belief was malleable, how the right story told by the right person could override any amount of evidence or protestation. Listening to that recording in court, watching the jury's faces as they heard the casual cruelty in Christopher's voice, Victoria understood that she was finally going to get her vindication. Not just legally, though that mattered, but socially, publicly, undeniably. The verdict came down on a Tuesday in May. Guilty on all counts. Christopher Bradford was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The sentencing judge made it clear that she viewed this case as particularly egregious, that the deliberate construction of a false narrative using illegal technological means represented a serious breach of trust and a violation of fundamental human rights. She recommended that he serve his sentence without possibility of parole. As the marshals led Christopher out of the courtroom, he looked directly at Victoria with an expression of pure hatred and disbelief. He couldn't understand how his carefully constructed lie had fallen apart. He couldn't accept that his power had limits, that his carefully articulated narrative had failed to overcome the truth. Victoria met his eyes and didn't look away. She held his gaze until he was gone, until there was nothing left but the echo of his conviction and the reality that he would spend the next 7 years in prison because of what he'd done to her. The public statement from the Bradford family came next, released through their legal representatives, and distributed to every news outlet that had originally covered the scandal. Victoria Chen was falsely accused of misconduct 4 years ago, based on deliberate fabrications by a member of our family. We deeply regret the harm caused to Ms. Chen by these false allegations and by our family's initial belief in them. We acknowledge that Ms. Chen has been vindicated by legal proceedings and DNA evidence. We offer our most sincere apologies and have provided full financial restitution for the damages she suffered. The retraction was front-page news. The vindication was front-page news. The revelation that one of Manhattan's most prominent families had been brought to their knees by a false accusation made national headlines. But more importantly, it meant that Victoria could reclaim her life. The job offers started coming within days. Companies that had rejected her years ago suddenly found her credentials impressive. Former colleagues who'd shunned her suddenly wanted to reconnect. People who'd believed the lie, who'd repeated it at dinner parties and on social media, suddenly fell silent or tried to pretend they'd never believed it at all. Victoria turned down most of the offers. She was thinking about what kind of future she wanted, what kind of work would matter to her, what kind of life she wanted to build, now that she finally had the power to build it deliberately, rather than desperately. She met with Daniel formally for the first time since the legal proceedings had concluded. They sat in Marcus Webb's office, neutral territory where they could talk without the weight of the past threatening to overwhelm them. "I want to know my son," Daniel said without preamble. "Not as compensation, not to make myself feel better about what I did, but because he's my son, and I love him already just knowing he exists. I've already made so many mistakes. I don't want to make the mistake of missing his childhood." Victoria studied him carefully. He'd changed in the months since their initial confrontation. The sleek corporate perfection had been replaced by something more authentic, more human, more real. The weight of his own guilt had carved out something real inside him. "His name is Marcus, but he goes by Mark," Victoria said. "He calls himself Mark because when he was 3, he decided Marcus was a big boy name and he wasn't ready to be a big boy yet. He likes building things. He likes drawing. He asks a lot of questions. He doesn't like being told no, and he doesn't trust easily. Is that my fault? Is that because of what happened to you while carrying him?" "Some of it probably is," Victoria admitted. "Children pick up on their mother's anxiety. He's sensitive to stress and fear. He needs consistency and predictability and safety. He needs to know that the people in his life are telling him the truth." Daniel nodded solemnly, absorbing this information like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard. "I want to take a paternity test," he said. "I know we have the DNA results already. I know it's proven biologically that he's my son. But I want to have it done officially, publicly, so there's never any doubt. So he'll never have to wonder. So he'll know absolutely that I'm his father, and I'm not going anywhere." They arranged the test for a Saturday morning at a private clinic in Manhattan. Victoria brought Mark, who didn't entirely understand what was happening. but was excited about the appointment because Daniel had promised ice cream afterward. Mark had Daniel's eyes. It was the first thing anyone noticed when they were together. The striking similarity between father and son. Mark had Victoria's darker skin tone, her careful way of observing the world before engaging with it. But his bone structure, his eyes, his smile, were pure Bradford. Daniel knelt in front of his son at the clinic, meeting him at eye level. "I'm going to be your daddy," Daniel said simply. "That means I'm going to be here for you. That means I'm going to help take care of you. That means when you grow up, you're going to know that you have a father who loves you more than anything in the world." Mark considered this serious statement with the gravity it deserved. "Will you take me to the park?" Mark asked. "Every week," Daniel promised. "Twice a week if you want. We can build things and climb trees and play whatever games you want to play. And ice cream." "And ice cream," Daniel agreed. The test came back positive, of course. 100% paternal match. The results were notarized and certified, made official in every way possible. Daniel's name was added to Mark's birth certificate. The legal paperwork was filed and processed and made permanent. But the real changes happened over the following months, as Daniel figured out how to be a father, how to show up consistently, how to be present in a way that mattered. He rearranged his work schedule. He bought an apartment in a family-friendly neighborhood where Mark would have friends and a community. He learned to braid his son's hair, to pack lunches, to sit through countless readings of the same children's book without losing his mind. He also worked with Victoria to establish co-parenting arrangements, legal agreements that protected Mark's interests, and ensured both parents had equal say in decisions about his education, health care, and well-being. They weren't together romantically, and Victoria didn't think they ever would be. The trauma of the past 4 years had changed both of them in ways that made a romantic relationship impossible. But they were allies. They were partners in the work of raising a child who deserved to know both of his parents, who deserved to have resources and love and security from both sides of his family. What Victoria didn't expect was the job opportunity that came from a completely different direction. Patricia Chen, the digital forensics expert who'd worked on the case against Christopher Bradford, approached Victoria with a proposal. Patricia was starting a non-profit organization dedicated to helping people who'd been falsely accused of crimes or misconduct by using cutting-edge digital forensics and legal support to prove their innocence. She wanted Victoria to be the director of operations. The work would focus on cases where digital evidence had been manipulated or fabricated. It would work with people who'd been destroyed by false accusations, just like Victoria had been destroyed. It would use the very same techniques that had freed Victoria to free others who were trapped in similar nightmares. Victoria accepted the position without hesitation. The office they set up in Brooklyn became a refuge for the desperate and the vindicated. There was the woman who'd been accused of embezzling money from her company, whose digital records had been completely fabricated by a colleague seeking revenge. There was the man who'd been accused of sexual harassment based on doctored emails that had never actually been sent. There was the teenager who'd been accused of distributing intimate photos she'd never even taken, whose entire social media presence had been created and populated with false evidence by a former friend. Each case was heartbreaking. Each case was infuriating. Each case was also a reminder of why Victoria was doing this work, why the vindication of truth mattered, why the exposure of lies was essential to a functioning society. 2 years after Christopher Bradford's conviction, Victoria's organization had helped exonerate 15 people. 15 people who'd had their lives destroyed by carefully constructed false narratives. 15 people who'd been freed by the work of patient, meticulous investigation and the power of scientific evidence. Mark was 6 years old now, in first grade, thriving in ways that Victoria had sometimes wondered if he ever would. He had his father's confidence and his mother's observant nature. He had friends at school and after-school activities. He had a therapist who'd helped him understand that the poverty and struggle his mother had experienced wasn't his fault, that he was loved, that he was safe. Daniel had become a genuine father, not in the superficial sense of biological connection, but in the real sense of showing up, of being present, of making decisions with Mark's well-being at the center. He'd also become an advocate, publicly supporting Victoria's nonprofit, funding its operations, using his platform and his resources to help other people vindicate themselves. The relationship between Victoria and Daniel had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. They weren't lovers, but they were bound together by their son and by a shared commitment to the truth. They'd worked through enough of the trauma of the past to have genuine conversations, to laugh together sometimes, to co-parent with a minimum of conflict. One evening, Mark fell asleep between them on the couch during a movie night at Daniel's apartment. Victoria looked at her son, sleeping peacefully, and then at Daniel, who was watching his son with an expression of such love and gratitude that it made her chest tighten. "I've been thinking," Daniel said quietly, so as not to wake Mark. "If someone had told me 4 years ago that the worst thing that happened to me would also lead to meeting my son, I wouldn't have believed them. I wouldn't have thought any good could come from that kind of pain." Victoria didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about the past 4 years, about the struggle and the survival, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding herself into someone stronger, someone whole, someone who could help other people navigate similar darkness. "I used to think I'd wasted 4 years, she said finally. "I used to think those years were just lost time, gone forever, years I could never get back. But I realize now that I built something during those years. I built resilience. I built determination. I built the ability to help other people. Those years weren't nothing." Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand, careful not to disturb Mark. "You're an amazing woman," he said. "You're an amazing mother. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. I'm sorry I made you have to prove it." "I know," Victoria said simply. And the thing between them, the tentative peace they'd negotiated, the understanding that they would never be what they might have been if Christopher hadn't destroyed that possibility, settled into something manageable, something real, something that worked. The documentary came out 3 years later. A filmmaker named Sarah Okonkwo had been following Victoria's organization since its inception, documenting the cases, the investigations, the vindications. The film was called Fabricated Truth, and it won the Audience Award at the Tribeca Film Festival. The documentary opened with Victoria's story. It showed her apartment in Queens, the studio space where she'd worked 3 jobs. It showed her meeting with Daniel outside his office building. It showed the courtroom where Christopher Bradford had been convicted. But more importantly, it showed the other cases, the other people, the other vindications. It showed the woman discovering that her embezzlement accusation had been cleared. It showed her calling her mother and telling her that she was finally ready to come home. It showed her mother's tears, her family's embrace, the slow process of rebuilding trust and acceptance. It showed each vindication as a small resurrection, a person coming back to life, a narrative being corrected, a truth emerging from beneath layers of lies. The documentary was watched by millions. It sparked conversations about the reliability of digital evidence, about the danger of false accusations, about the importance of thorough investigation before belief. It sparked policy changes in courts across the country, increased funding for digital forensics, new protocols for how accusations should be handled and investigated. Most importantly, it changed how people thought about Victoria Chen. She was no longer the woman who'd been falsely accused. She was the woman who'd been falsely accused, and then spent years helping others. She was a symbol of resilience. She was a symbol of justice, finally served. 3 months after the documentary premiered, Victoria received a call from a prosecutor in Sacramento, California. He was reopening a case from 12 years ago, a case where a woman had been convicted of fraud based on doctored digital evidence. The woman had been in prison for a decade. New technology suggested that the evidence had been manipulated, and the prosecutor wanted Victoria's organization to investigate. They did. They found the evidence had been fabricated by the victim's former business partner. They compiled a comprehensive report. The conviction was overturned. The woman was released. At the press conference announcing the exoneration, the woman made a statement thanking Victoria's organization for the work they'd done. "I've lost 12 years of my life," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. 12 years I can never get back. But at least now I have the truth. At least now the world knows I didn't do the crimes I was accused of. At least now I can try to rebuild something from what's left." Victoria watched from the back of the room, and she thought about her own journey, about the 4 years she'd lost, about the way those years had led her to this place where she could help other people find their way out of similar darkness. She thought about Mark, who was 9 years old now, who wanted to be a lawyer like his father, who was taking piano lessons and learning to play soccer and growing up into someone who understood, inherently, that telling the truth mattered. She thought about Daniel, who'd transformed from a man who'd destroyed her life with his lack of faith into someone who was dedicating his own legal career to helping people who'd been falsely accused, who was using his position and power to fight for justice in ways that mattered. She thought about the lie that Christopher Bradford had told, the lie that had seemed so permanent, so immovable, so much like the truth. And she thought about how that lie had ultimately led to her finding purpose, finding community, finding a way to transform pain into power. Standing in that courthouse, watching yet another person claim their freedom, their vindication, their truth, Victoria understood something fundamental about survival and resilience. She understood that sometimes the things that destroy us are also the things that teach us who we really are. Sometimes the lies that devastate us are also the catalysts for finding our deepest purpose. The story that had begun with a false accusation and a destroyed life had transformed into something entirely different. It had become a story about truth. It had become a story about resilience. It had become a story about the power of refusing to disappear quietly, of choosing to fight, of choosing to rebuild, of choosing to help other people do the same. 5 years after Christopher Bradford's conviction, Victoria and Daniel stood in the bleachers of Mark's school, watching their 9-year-old son play in the championship soccer game. Daniel's arm was around Victoria's shoulders in a gesture of easy friendship, a comfort that came from years of co-parenting, of navigating difficult terrain together, of building something real from the ruins of the past. Mark scored the winning goal with 2 minutes left in the game. He looked up into the bleachers, found his parents, and waved. Daniel and Victoria cheered, their voices joining the roar of the crowd, their faces bright with pride. Later, at the celebration dinner, Mark sat between his parents, his cheeks flushed from playing, his eyes bright with excitement. "You were amazing out there," Victoria said, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be an incredible soccer player," Daniel agreed, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. Mark looked from one parent to the other, and Victoria could see the moment of clarity in his expression, the moment when he understood that his family was unconventional, but it was real. It was solid. It was built on love, even if it wasn't built on the traditional foundation of two parents who were romantically involved. "Are you guys going to get back together?" Mark asked with the innocent directness of a child. "No, sweetheart," Victoria said gently. "But your dad and I love each other in a different way now. And we both love you so much. That's what family is sometimes. It's not always what the storybooks show, but that doesn't make it less real." Daniel nodded, squeezing Victoria's hand under the table. "Your mom is the bravest, strongest person I know," Daniel said to his son, "and I'm grateful every single day that she gave me a chance to be your father. I'm grateful every day for the life we have together, all three of us." Mark seemed satisfied with this explanation. He went back to eating his pizza, secure in the knowledge that he was loved, that he was wanted, that he was safe. Victoria looked around the restaurant at the life they'd built from the ashes of the old one. She looked at the scars that remained from the trauma, but she also looked at the strength that had grown in response to that trauma. She looked at the man she'd once loved in a different way, a way that had transformed into something sustainable, something real, something that actually worked. She looked at her son, the child who'd been born in secret, who'd grown up in poverty and near homelessness, who'd somehow emerged whole and loving and resilient. She looked at the future that stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but no longer terrifying, full of possibility instead of constraint. She thought about all the other people she'd helped vindicate, all the other people who'd been destroyed by false accusations and lies, all the other people who'd had to find their way back to themselves through layers of trauma and betrayal. She thought about the work that still lay ahead, the cases still to be investigated, the truths still to be uncovered. And she allowed herself, for the first time in the 8 years since Christopher Bradford had destroyed her life, to feel something she'd almost given up on. She allowed herself to feel happy. Not the fragile, temporary happiness of a moment of good news, but the deeper, more sustained happiness that came from surviving something that was supposed to destroy you, from choosing to rebuild rather than disappear, from transforming pain into purpose. The lie that had seemed so devastating had ultimately led her here, to this place, to this life, to this understanding of who she really was. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. She was a woman who'd been unjustly accused and who'd refused to accept that false narrative as her truth. And now she spent her days helping other people do the same. As the celebration dinner continued around them, as Mark told increasingly animated stories about the soccer game, as Daniel laughed at his son's enthusiasm, Victoria raised her glass and made a silent toast to truth. To the idea that sometimes it takes years for the truth to emerge, but it always, eventually, finds its way to the surface. It always finds a way to correct the lies, to vindicate the innocent, to restore justice. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. Refuse to accept the false narrative. Refuse to let a lie become the permanent story of their life. And sometimes, if they're willing to fight long enough, hard enough, persistently enough, the truth finally breaks through. The lie finally cracks. The false accusation finally crumbles. And the person who was destroyed by that lie gets to choose what they build from the wreckage. Victoria Chen had built a life worth living. She had built a legacy of truth. And she had built a family that understood, in its bones, that believing the worst about people without evidence was a choice, and that choosing to believe and support each other even when circumstances were confusing was a different, far more powerful choice. The future, when it came, would bring new challenges and new joys. But for tonight, in this moment, Victoria allowed herself to be exactly where she was. Present, grateful, free. And that, she thought, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.